Good evening, everyone. My name is Nicole Cozier. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the Senior Vice President of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at HRC. It is my pleasure to welcome you to HRC's 6th annual BIPOC Mental Health Panel discussion. From its conception to now our 6th offering of this program, this work has been deftly and thoughtfully stewarded by Fee Regis and has continued to grow and deepen every year. And while I miss being able to be in physical community with you all, I am thrilled that we have been able to continue to engage in this work and partnership, and also by being virtual, engage even more people for the program than we were when we were in person. So with that, I want to give a big welcome and thank you to all of you for joining us this evening, and for those of you who will be joining us in the future via the recording. I have a few acknowledgements to make before we get started. First, I would like to say thank you to ASL translator, Kaylee. Thank you for joining us year after year, Kaylee, and making sure that we are reaching a broad audience of our community. I'd also like to thank my colleagues at HRC, especially Fee Regis, Ana Flores, Nikaya Lynch, Raina Nelson, Jose Soto, Alex Costello, and Sam Cromwell, who have been so instrumental in putting this program together and bringing it to you wherever you're receiving it. Being able to do this program and supporting queer and trans BIPOC mental health is really important to us at HRC, and it's particularly important to me personally. 6 years ago, we could have not imagined how increasingly crucial this conversation would become. We've always known that queer and trans, Black, Indigenous, people of color communities are too often forced to endure the negative effects of both racism and anti-LGBTQ+ bias, elevating stress and trauma and creating or compounding mental health challenges. From generations of trauma carried from our ancestors to our present day, to the indignities, injustices, fear, and violence we continue to experience as queer and transgender BIPOC people, compounded by a protracted pandemic that continues to disproportionately impact BIPOC and LGBTQ people. The challenges to our physical health and mental health are profound. And all too often, the barriers to seeking support in the wake of these challenges are also profound. From institutional barriers to community stigma around seeking mental health support, a medical community that overestimates our tolerance for pain and trauma, has unreasonable expectations for our resilience, and/or is not affirming of our gender identities, sexual orientations, and racial experiences. This year's mental health awareness theme is more than the numbers. Through the program today, we will share personal stories that show that we are more than statistics, more than diagnostic labels, more than the trauma we experience. We are whole people. We are leaders. We are loved ones. We are caretakers, and we are change makers. Our mental health is not shameful. It is beautiful, like us, and core to who we are. And we hope that after hearing these stories of brilliance and resilience, you are encouraged to demand accountability from our institutions and communities and make it clear that BIPOC mental health needs to be treated with the same care and loving attention as we do any other aspect of our health and well-being. With that said, we have a great program for you this evening to do just that, and we are excited to bring you our amazing guests. Thank you, and I look forward to learning and healing together. Now, I would like to turn it over to our host and moderator for the evening, Fee Regis.
Thank you so much, Nicole, for that amazing opening. We really appreciate all that you do for our community. So, as Nicole mentioned, my name is Fee Regis, and pronouns, and I am amazing, powerful conversations. We're so excited to have you all join us. As a first-generation Haitian American, Black, queer, trans femme person, it means so much to me to be having a conversation that can include all parts of myself, my full authentic self. And that's what we're here today to do, to talk about all of the parts of ourselves and have the conversation and get some healing, right? So with that, I have the honor of introducing Laquanda Roberts Buckley. Laquanda is a suicide attempt survivor with 16 years of mental health experience with an emphasis on advocacy, policy, crisis management, and the creation of safe, nurturing spaces for BIPOC communities. Reiki master, certified life coach, licensed master social worker, speaker, and the executive director of Black Women Incorporated. And she manages both PTSD and bipolar 1 disorder. Laquanda is going to lead us in a breathing exercise to get us all started. Laquanda, take us away.
Thank you, Fee. We're going to begin by simply taking breaths to acknowledge, breathing in and breathing out wherever it feels safe and comfortable to do so. In our acknowledgements, we acknowledge what today has been for us, and we also acknowledge what today has not. And with our breath, we acknowledge our presence and where we are right now. As we move and transcend from our acknowledgement, we release with our breath those things that may have felt like a burden or stressful or any triggers we may have encountered. We breathe in and we release. And then we begin to ground ourselves to receive this information with the intention and the acknowledgement that today you are in a safe space, and today you are seen, and today you are heard. We will close out with a deep reflecting breath and release. See?
With that, I'm ready to go. All right, so I'm going to introduce our second list. We're honored to introduce Dr. Crosby, clinical psychologist practicing in Washington, D.C., while working with ethnic, sexual orientation, and gender minorities across the lifespan, individuals living with HIV/AIDS and other chronic illnesses, substance abuse, and other marginalized groups. Currently, Dr. Crosby provides psychotherapy to individuals and couples through his private practice, Affirmative Spaces, and teaches at the undergraduate level. His research and clinical specialty areas include BIPOC and LGBTQIA+ mental health, as well as African American psychology and intersectionality. With that, we're so thrilled to welcome you today. Thank you, Dr. Crosby.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
All right. Next, I'm thrilled to welcome Nikaya Lynch. Nikaya Lynch is an HRC staff member. They use they, them pronouns. They're a former HRC youth ambassador and a current advocate for intersectionality within the LGBTQ+ rights movement. Welcome, Nikaya. All right, next up, we have Kay Smith. Kay uses any pronouns. Kay is a queer Japanese American community college student and advocate. In high school, they were in and out of mental health institutions and learned the importance of being accepted by those that are meant to help you. They are now using their experiences to advocate for more culturally competent care within the mental health system. Welcome, Kay. All right, last but most certainly not least, we have Lucy Chaco. They use they, she, and he pronouns. Lucy is a 16-year-old gender fluid, queer, and South Asian activist and musician. Luke has been working with HRC for 2 years now. Welcome. And again, a huge thank you to Kaylee for providing ASL interpretation for today's panel. We're thrilled to welcome back Laquanda to today's panel. We're going to dive into our panel today. So I'm going to ask this first question. Why is discussing mental health in QTBIPOC communities important to you? And when I say QTBIPOC, that means queer and trans, Black, Indigenous, people of color communities. We're going to start with Dr. Crosby, then we're going to go to Kay, then we'll go to Nikaya, and then we'll end with Laquanda.
Thank you so much. I think that the conversation is something that is really, really important because as queer BIPOC folks, queer trans BIPOC folks, there's so many different challenges that we face in the world, aside from just those marginalized identities we hold, individual identity, those individual marginalized identities have their own stressors. When we start layering marginalized identities on top of marginalized identities, it makes it very challenging to navigate the world, to navigate these different subgroup spaces. And so I think being able to talk about the collective and whole experience is something that is very much needed and very important for us.
I agree. Okay.
To echo a lot of what Dr. Crosby was saying, being accepted and validated and seen in our identities is extremely important because it informs so much of our health and happiness. And so it's important for me to have a space to be able to talk about and examine how the world treats our individual identities as queer and BIPOC people. Because I've noticed that not feeling accepted or validated in my own identity permeates the rest of my relationships, my health. And so identity is the foundation of our well-being.
Ooh, I love that. Nikaya?
Great answer, Kay. And just to bounce off of that, I definitely agree. I think for me, my biggest motivation is the fact that I am a queer BIPOC person who struggles with mental health. And so growing up, because it was such a taboo subject, I felt alone a lot of the times in spaces that were supposed to be accepting towards me. So knowing that I'm not the only person who deals with these types of problems on top of having my identities motivates me to want to speak about it more so that other people can feel less alone.
Yes, yes, yes. Luke?
Absolutely. Just echoing off of what everybody else had said, just like having that kind of space is super important because it kind of is the core factor to queer, trans, BIPOC happiness, right? And so kind of just allowing people to have those spaces and have those conversations, and having this conversation is super important because, again, echoing off of what Dr. Crosby had said, we kind of deal as queer, trans, BIPOC people with this kind of different intersectionality. As a person of color, as a queer person who also struggles with mental health, it's just all different things intersecting with each other. And so it's just super important that we have those spaces to feel comfortable and safe.
Yes. Laquanda, do you want to close us out for this question?
And for me, it was about challenging the misconceptions of what people feel that I act like, that I respond like, what my voice sounds like. Um, the type of job that I can hold. It's just allowing people to see what someone with my multitude of identities is able to do, and actually, speak in those rooms in which, we may be the only ones there to do so. And so a lot of it has been about, challenging, those views that people think don't concern or reflect us.
Very well said. And that sort of is a great tie into my next question. As folks have mentioned, as queer and trans, Black, Indigenous, people of color communities, we are holding multiple identities that unfortunately are still minoritized, marginalized, and we don't experience those separately, right? I don't experience, trauma from systems of oppression only on my Black identity or only on my trans femme identity, right? More often than not, they're experienced at the same time and they overlap. So I'm curious if folks can share an example of a time that you felt the impact of having multiple marginalized identities, and how did that make you feel? So we're going to start with Nikaya, then go to Lucy, then go to Kay, and then Dr. Crosby and Laquanda, feel free to add anything if you'd like.
Sure. I think when I think about the impact of feeling multiple identities in my life, I think I can trace that feeling very heavily to back in high school. Not to say that I don't experience that today as well, but in high school, it was something I felt way more consciously. I went to a majority white, wealthy high school, and it was around the time that we had several Black Lives Matter protests kick off in the city near me, as well as Trump being elected. And there was like just a celebration of just racism and homophobia at the same time within the school. And I would try to seek, comfort within the queer space that I had, the GSA, but it was still a majority white area. So I'm seeking comfort within a majority white area, and I still am not able to see myself and my identities fully represented and not feel totally safe, because at the same time, let me understand what it's like to be a queer and oppressed under this legislation, but not necessarily what it's like to be Black, queer, and oppressed under that legislation.
So powerful. Absolutely. Lucy?
Absolutely, yeah. So for me, being South Asian, as well as trans, queer, and someone who struggles with depression and anxiety, it gets difficult because of those different kind of intersecting um, minorities in a way. Being South Asian, there's this stereotype that especially in South Asian families, mental health isn't really a topic of discussion. It's not to be talked about in those families. It's not to be addressed, and so same thing with being trans and queer as well. It's just not something that we can talk about in those South Asian families, and so when those things kind of intersect together, it kind of just brings everything back up to me, and it becomes a one big thing. And as you said, Fee, before, is you experience those minorities not separately but together, and so when those minority um, suppressions are being put back onto us, it causes this kind of combustion in our brains and our bodies. And for me at least, it kind of just takes me and pulls me to a place of deep darkness and kind of a realization of there's nobody I have in my family. There's no one I have in my trans queer family, because nobody can experience the same kind of thing I'm feeling as well. And it gets difficult in that sense, to where sometimes just people can't understand what I go through because of the kind of different intersectionalities I go through. And it's just a matter of finding a way to, because we all do go through different experiences, but kind of finding a way to where we can accommodate everybody's feelings and experiences and make them feel as valid as possible.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It can be really hard sometimes to find spaces, to find help that feels representative of all of your identities. I really like the way you shared that, Lucy. Thank you. Okay.
I would say the epitome for me of having to deal with all of my identities was navigating the mental health system when I was institutionalized. And the difficulties that came with that was I was trying to navigate this very mostly white system. Most of the patients in my area were white, most of the counselors were white. And so they didn't know how to treat me as a person with a family that had people that didn't necessarily speak English and grew up in a different country. And so for me, it was having to find these and deal with these counselors that didn't know how to meet my needs and also take care of basically my racial trauma, and at the same time also trying to navigate the fact that I was queer and figuring out that I was queer in the mental health system, and trying to find counselors that understood basically even accepted queer people. And so it was all that combined of I was just trying to get treatment. I wasn't trying to it shouldn't have been my responsibility to try and find these counselors. I was just trying to get help for my mental health issues, and instead I was having to navigate this very white system and dealing with racism and also compounding my existing trauma. And so in that instance, I realized this system was not meant to treat people like me, and it frankly still isn't. And so that's something that I want to see change, and hopefully that other patients won't have to experience the same thing.
Wow. Absolutely. Dr. Crosby, Laquanda, anything you'd like to add to close out that question?
Just yes to everything everyone said. Yes. It is the Kay. I love what you said in terms of the healthcare system really not being for us. It's not designed for us in any way. It is a Eurocentric, heteronormative approach, and it doesn't take into account our experiences at all, from the line of questions that they ask us to the treatment. We usually have to fight for treatment of any kind. And that, if we're in a state of disarray where we are seeking help physically or mental health wise, we don't want to have that added barrier and pressure of begging for help. I mean, if that is not just a whole experience of the, minority, if that is just not representative, of the whole minority experience, I don't know what is. So I'm hoping that the system does change. And for me, that's part of the reason, in addition to my own experiences with marginalized identities and multiple examples and experiences of oppression, part of the reason why I do this work.
And we're so grateful that you're doing it. Laquanda, anything you'd add before we move on?
And I also, my experiences have always centered about being that one person in the room and the pressures that come with being that one person in that room. And I would say to anyone who finds yourself where you are that person, ensure that after those meetings that you have a de-escalation plan for yourself, that you've created a safe place for yourself, because so much of our identities can be pulled when we are in these environments that don't represent us, and your voice sometimes feels emotionally strained when you have to say, oh, don't forget about that person, and oh, don't forget about that person. And when you speak and just having to ask someone to acknowledge that a part of you exists cause conflict in the room, it can be overwhelming. So much of that aspect goes into caring for yourself when you walk into these spaces, when you're trying to change these systems.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And with that, we're going to transition to the next question. A lot of what was shared by the panelists on the last question talked about, pieces of their identities being siloed in a way, right? Or being invisibilized even at different times. And we see that siloing happen in other ways as well, right? Too often, mental health is siloed from other parts of our health, right? For example, our physical health. So I'm curious if our panelists can share whether they've noticed any changes in their body physically that maybe your doctor or your research has shown that may stem or be exacerbated by your mental health challenges. So, for example, I live with anxiety, and I've recently found out that, high anxiety can contribute to back problems. Who would have known? Something about the restricted breathing and the lack of oxygen can cause changes in the spinal canal. What? I don't know. But yeah, things like that. I'm curious if anyone has experienced anything similar. I'll start with Laquanda, then go to Dr. Crosby, then go to Luke, and then Nikaya and Kay. If you'd like to add anything, feel free.
When I used to practice, I'm a retired therapist now. A lot of individuals that I would see would have migraines due to the level of stress that they would have. They will have issues with eating, whether that's eating too much when they're afraid, they're overwhelmed, or not eating enough because they put so much on their plate, to where, they don't have time for themselves, and maybe they're just snacking here and there. Sometimes we're just operating so much in survival mode, right? To where we don't even know that we are just going and going and going. And our mental health cues don't go off so that we would stop. It's usually that physical health system that comes in that says, whoop, this is too much. And I experienced that 2 years ago because I did not realize how much I was putting on myself to try to be that superhero, to save everyone. And then my doctor said, you're looking like you have high blood pressure. And it's like, woo, it's like, then all of a sudden, the main thing isn't the main thing anymore. And so much about this silo is to ensure that before we hit those physical cues, that we understand what those mental cues are for us, and that we're doing stress audits for ourselves. We're doing those self-care assessments for ourselves to balance and see where we are with things. Because once that physical hit, it's a lot more work that has to be done. So if we can take the time to hear what we say when we're trying to hear what everyone else is saying, that silo that takes place, we can slow that down.
Yes. Dr. Crosby.
Beautiful. I am thinking what's coming up for me right now is that oftentimes as communities of color, as queer folks, trauma has become so normalized for us that we don't even realize that we're in trauma, that we're reacting to and or experiencing trauma. Because it's the norm. And it's not really until we sit down with someone and start sharing our experiences and they're like, hold up, that doesn't sound okay. That we realize, oh, everyone doesn't deal with this. And so as a result, because it does become the norm, I think our body adjusts and we're just used to it. But once we become aware of that tension that we're holding, that anxiety, that depression, that generational trauma, I think we start to alleviate physically, our symptoms start to alleviate because we're actually processing the material. There's some trauma work that talks about and you all may have heard of the book, it's a book called The Body Keeps the Score. But essentially, it's about how trauma, if we don't deal with it, lands in our body. And our body and our emotional memories are so much deeper than our brains and physical memory. So it's really important that we figure that out. For myself, I will say that I noticed anxious symptoms coming up, particularly when I was entering spaces where I was the only one, which is often, where I was the only one across multiple identities. And so, I don't know my stuff, but then sometimes I get in the room, my heart starts beating, I can't access them, I'm sweating, and I'm like, what's going on? And it wasn't really until shortly after grad school, I realized what was going on and that it wasn't me. And I know we hear a lot about imposter syndrome, and I kind of push back to that because I say that's really a trauma response and an expectation based on whiteness of what is acceptable versus unacceptable. And so realizing that and not owning that, because if I say I have imposter syndrome, now I'm saying it's okay for you to push your anxiety into me. So now I don't have imposter syndrome. I'm just not playing the game that heteronormative cishet white folks have set up.
Dr. Crosby, I almost threw the mouse. I almost ran around the room. Wow. Exactly. Luke?
I think if we're talking about and Dr. Crosby, what an amazing and vulnerable and just incredible response. Thank you so much for that. And thank you so much, Laquanda, as well, for that vulnerable and amazing response. I think when it comes to mental health, we need to understand that the brain controls our body. And every single part of the brain controls our body. When it comes to our temporal lobe and our hippocampus controls our weight and what we eat, and the medulla controls our breathing. We need to understand the brain is what makes our bodies our bodies. And for me personally, I'm going to be a little bit vulnerable, if that's okay. A year and a half ago, I was not eating because I am diagnosed with depression and anxiety, and I'm also diagnosed with insomnia. And because of that depression and anxiety that I have and have been experiencing for the past few years now, that's what's rooted from my insomnia. So if we're talking, body and how our bodies have changed, it's also sleep schedules are changing as well. But I think also for when it comes down to my depression and anxiety, I wasn't eating because my body was telling me that I wasn't worth it enough. My mind was telling me I wasn't worth it to eat. And I feel like a lot of us here maybe have experienced gender dysphoria and body dysmorphia. And going through that as someone who's trying to, as someone who's trying to, change and discover themselves at age 15, 16, it's really difficult to see something you're not happy with on your body. And when your mind is so backed up by that depression, that anxiety, and also kind of just that intersectionality of different, discrimination we experience in those minorities, your mind is so clogged and it doesn't tell you the right thing. And so for months, I wasn't eating real meals. My weight was at 100 for a good 2 months. that's not good at all. As a 16-year-old who's 5'7", so it's just really, it was really difficult on my body, and my sleep schedule. I wouldn't sleep at nights, and I ended up starting to self-harm. And I thought I wasn't worth it, and I'm a suicide attempt survivor, and I am so grateful to still be here and on this earth. I'm 500 days sober from self-harm, and I haven't self-harmed in 500 days, more than that actually. I've been eating, I've been taking care of my body, I'm on medications, and I've been going to therapies, and without that, my body, and I just don't know if I would still be here. And so I think we need to understand that it's yes, it's a matter of our bodies, but we need to understand our bodies are so sacred and so worth it, and especially when we're trying to cope with it in different ways. And I know I tried coping with it sexually, and just without just eating and just stuff like that. It's just a matter of finding the right way to cope with that kind of anxiety and depression you are feeling. And it really didn't happen until I got my first job, until I realized I'm not going to be taken advantage of, and I'm not going to let anybody take advantage of me. And that has to start with me. And I have to start taking myself and loving myself. And I can't be working these 30-hour weeks unless I start saying something and taking care of myself. And it really took that turn for me, and I've never felt better. I feel great now. I feel just excited to be in my body. I love my body. I love myself, and I'm just super grateful to still be on earth.
Wow, 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 wow. I really, really want to thank you for your vulnerability there. That was so powerful, so powerful. A lot of that resonates with me and my experiences, and a lot of what I've heard from many of my friends and other folks in the community. I want to pause for a really quick second. Dr. Crosby and Laquanda, I know you're now a retired therapist, but Dr. Crosby, I know you're still practicing. I know you may have seen patients that have similar experiences as Lucy just shared. I'm curious, when you have those clients, what are some things you recommend to them? So if someone might be experiencing something similar to Lucy right now that's watching this, what are some of the things that you would recommend to them?
One of the things that I would recommend initially would be to share the experience. Oftentimes, when we're dealing with things, it feels like we're the only ones. And that's largely because of the communities we're surrounding ourselves with. But when we feel like we're the only ones, then that's the breeding ground for shame. And one thing we know about shame is shame makes you want to hide. And so if you hide, then you're going to do everything in secrecy. So the more you're able to tell your story, it becomes more normalized. And your experience, it becomes more normalized. And so then it's not something to be afraid of or to fear or shame, but you can actually start to feel the chance to do something differently about it. But also recognizing that not everyone deserves access to that degree of vulnerability. And so identifying who is deserving of that sacred space would be my initial recommendations. And thank you so much for sharing and being vulnerable in that way.
Laquanda, anything?
And I would simply, Dr. Crosby, wonderful. I would simply say that we would develop and create what your care support team would look like. And that would include me. And the goal would be that I may be your strongest anchor in the beginning. But as we identify safe spaces for you, which is so, so important, like Dr. Crosby says, everybody doesn't have access to that information. Creating safe spaces, not this is a sticker we put on the door for you to come in, but we heard someone say, this is a safe space that I can be in. If I have no other place to be myself, this is where I can be. And so we will work to identify those spaces together. And if your therapist, your counselor is the only person in that moment, let them know that so that they can help you identify some key places where you can be safe. Because counselors are resourceful and we can help you connect with people when you feel like you don't have anyone else around you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We're going to circle back to our regularly scheduled programming. Nikaya and Kay, did you have anything to add to that question? And just to remind you, that was if you've noticed any changes in your body that you think might stem from or be exacerbated by any of the mental health challenges that you live with.
I can add something. So, fortunately, one of the good things that came out of the pandemic for me, which there are very few, was that I was forced to kind of take a pause and really analyze what I wanted out of my life. And that forced me to go like launch on this huge mental health journey because I didn't realize it, but I was actually really struggling with anxiety. And what ended up leading me to this discovery was that I like a couple of years ago on New Year's Eve, I was like trying to sleep and then I couldn't and I started like breathing really weird and I was like, oh my goodness, I'm gonna die. Like this is it, I'm gonna die. So um I went to what is it called? Urgent care, and they prescribed me the Calm app. They told me it was a panic attack. I thought I was dying. And they explained to me that I probably was going through a lot of different stressors, and I had no idea because I wasn't paying attention to those warning signs in my body. I was just go 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 go, and I was working and working towards something that I didn't know how to attain, and so after leading me to that journey, I ended up going to a bunch of other doctors, specifically specializing in lungs and heart, and learned that I had really bad high blood pressure. And they were like, "We're gonna amputate your legs if you don't work on this." And da da da. They're thinking that I have some like overlapping medical issue, and that I'm gonna like I have like something wrong with like my diet or anything. It was all just stress. It was all just stress. It was all just stress and anxiety. And I didn't realize how much your mental health could affect your physical health in that way. And in the same way, I've been navigating my journey with learning how to live with my bipolar disorder. And one of the biggest things that has helped me with living with my bipolar disorder has been taking my medication. And your medication makes you gain weight, and then you go to the doctor after going on this like long self-love journey and this mental health journey where you learn how to love yourself and your body, and the doctor is like, you're fat and you're terrible and you're this and you're that, and you have to navigate the fat phobia within the medical system, and then you get depressed and then you gain even more weight because now you're not exercising, and then you go back to the doctor and they're saying it's like a huge cycle of just like having this back and forth pull between my mental health and my physical health and trying to find that balance, which I think is going to be really hard for me just because of the society that we live in and the expectations that we place not only upon ourselves, but that are placed on us as being Black people. And specifically for me, like being a Black, I wouldn't say I'm a woman, but like someone who experiences misogyny in this society. And the expectations that we have to be a specific size or to be a specific mindset or have a specific strength as Black people and as femme presenting people can really take a toll, and it makes it hard for us to really seek help because the systems in which, like Kay was saying earlier, the systems in which we seek this help are all still run by the same mindset that we have within our Eurocentric society. So yeah, just relating to everything everyone was saying.
Spot on. Spot on. Kay, anything you'd add to that before we move on?
I would say actually, so I also struggle a lot with anxiety, and I developed my chronic health issues because of my anxiety. And so I found that a lot of times, and I'm trying to get better with this, it's a lot easier for me to talk about my chronic health issues rather than my mental health issues. And so when I'm actually experiencing a mental health episode or a crisis, I might cover that and say, oh, I'm just having issues with chronic health, like my body's having an issue. And really, they're all related and they're just as valid. And I found that, like you were saying, Nikaya, about the medical system, like it's a lot easier for me to get treatment for my physical body rather than my mental health, which is a problem because they're related. And so I realized that I'm trying to make the steps to be more open about the fact that, hey, I'm actually having issues with my mental health right now. I need a day. And making it normal that, hey, you need mental health days sometimes, just like your body needs rest.
100%. 100%. So along this same line of, important aspects of our identity or important aspects of our life being separated in ways that they really can't, because that doesn't align with our experience, right? Another way that might happen is, sometimes in mental health, there's a focus on, the level of chemicals in your brain, or trauma that you may have experienced, et cetera. And sometimes that focus may take us away from some of the other factors, like socioeconomic factors, that may be having a huge impact on our mental health, if not exacerbating those and creating that sort of cycle that both Nikaya and Kay were just talking about. So, for example, challenges finding sustainable jobs, struggles to find affordable housing, etc. So I'm curious, if folks can share what the impact of those socioeconomic factors have been for them, and what they think their mental health would look like if you weren't navigating racism, anti-LGBTQ plus bias, etc. I will start. I know that's a mouthful. I will start with Kay, then we'll go to Lucy, then we'll go to Nikaya, and Dr. Crosby and Laquanda. If you'd like to add anything, we'll go to you after that. Okay.
I would say for me growing up, money was always an issue in our family, in the sense that like our economic status is always causing underlying stress for us. And so I felt like at all times growing up, there was a sense of like anxiety no matter what about our like livelihood and whether we were going to be okay. And now, having grown up a bit and going to community college, I realized that while it's an affordable option for my family, it also means that community college sometimes doesn't have as many resources, I hate to admit it, as a lot of four-year institutions don't, and as a lot of four-year institutions do. And so I realized that the community college that I go to doesn't have a lot of diversity and equity inclusion efforts. They just got a cultural center. And also within the queer spaces that I found in my community college, it's all white, and it's me and one other person that is BIPOC. So I found that while I want to balance the fact that I want to make sure that I'm having the most affordable options for my family, it's also difficult to have to be in that situation where like, hey, I don't have as much access, and I need that access sometimes for my own well-being. I would say in terms of what my mental health would look like if I didn't have to navigate all these systems, racism and discrimination is something that and homophobia, transphobia, it all compounds on itself, in the sense that like trauma compounds, and like each experience kind of keeps digging at those like old hurts and the pain that you feel every day. And so I feel like it would take so much weight off of my shoulders of like having to deal with the constant reminders of being other, and just being able to be me. Yeah.
So well put. So well put. Lucy?
So I'm fortunate enough to live in a very well socioeconomic status with my family. I'm fortunate enough that they can't afford to go to therapy, and I can't afford my medications. And I understand that that's not the same for everyone, and I'm very extremely grateful that I can get that help I need. But I also think just to think about, when I think about the mental health system, and just like who it's run by, I think we need to understand that this is not just people need help. It's a money business, and it's run by money, and it's funny to me that like we have to pay for therapy when therapy is like it's a coping mechanism, right? And then sometimes the therapy isn't even that worth it. It's like, oh, try this breathing exercise, and you pay $150 a session just for a breathing exercise that you could have looked up on Google. And it's like, it's a money run business. And then but on top of therapy or counseling, you have to go to a psychiatrist, right? You have a psychiatrist, and then a psychologist, and then let's say you need to go to the hospital. Well, here, go to the hospital, and they'll put you in an inpatient program or an outpatient program. Money, 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 money. It's all this money that you're spending on just a way to get your mind better. And then previously, as we stated before, talking about the body and everything, like Nikaya was saying, as they were saying that they had to go to the urgent care. So it's like, on top of that, you have to pay for those urgent care expenses as well, just when we're trying to fix our mind. And it's like, I'm so serious to you. If we had access to free therapy and medication that people needed, the way that our society would kind of just elevate, it would just, and it's also a matter of course, who wants the help, right? Who wants the help, and who's going to accept that help. But most people are willing to accept that help. So why are we not letting these people get the help that they want, and at affordable rates and affordable prices? I'm not gonna sit here and act like therapy is cheap, because it's not cheap, and I know it takes a big toll on my family for me to go to therapy. But it's a matter of who. It's the fact that I can afford therapy and my family can afford that. What about the other people who have gone through the same experiences as me, who have gone through the eating disorders, who have gone through self harm and stuff like that? Why why are we at such a high suicide rate when we could literally be saving people's lives by just allowing this to be so much cheaper, even then free?
Absolutely. 100%. I think, many of us, if not all of us, can relate to the challenges of affording, just trying to find care. And, to your point, there's always some, sort of irony, if you will, in the way that, the therapy system is requiring you to put money in to the system, where it's oftentimes the system that's creating the mental health challenges. So it's like, I'm paying you for the challenges you brought to me. Okay, fine. Kay, I'm sorry, Nikaya.
Yeah, I would just say that socioeconomic status was something that literally was the downfall of my mental health. Like when I was giving that example of my anxiety and the fact that I was just going and going and going and pursuing, it was literally just because I was so terrified of where I was going to live and how I was going to afford to eat and things like that, that I put my mental health on the back burner to the point that I got physically ill. And um, the idea that like there could be a world in which I wouldn't suffer from capitalism or racism or transphobia or homophobia, I think that would genuinely cure me. And I'm not saying cure me as in like my mental illnesses would go away, but just that I could function in a society that was catered towards those mental illnesses. Because in my opinion, all that ableism stems from the cis heteropatriarchy and specifically Eurocentrism. I believe that during colonialism, we were taught ideas of how each person should be and how they should think, and that we carry that with us when we are ableist towards each other. That we have these ideas of how people should behave and how they should process information, how they should think, and how they should exist. And if those weren't forced upon us and we could just be ourselves, despite whether or not it was a mental illness or a neurodivergence or however you function in the world, like you could just be yourself and feel accepted, it wouldn't be an issue. Like if I could just be ADHD or be bipolar or be depressed and have like not to worry about the stigma or the oppression of society because of how I manage my day-to-day life, like I would be fine. I would be so happy. I was so mad you asked that question because now I'm thinking about it. And now I'm like, I wish I did live in a world like that. Like, but c'est la vie. Um, and yeah, I grieve so much for like our ancestors and people who didn't have this language to be able to communicate what our needs are, because we shouldn't even have to explain ourselves in the first place, in my opinion. I think that all stems from colonialism. The need to explain yourself in this society so that you can be better, what's the word I'm looking for? Assimilated into the cis heteropatriarchy versus being able to just think the way you think and feel the way you feel.
Oh my goodness. I could have literally not said it any better. Dr. Crosby, Laquanda, anything you'd add to that? All
I
right.
would have to say that when you understand this conversation is that healing in and of itself, every aspect of it has been commercialized due to capitalism, but also due to racism, and also rooted in a history of slavery. Because if you think about it, we had methods of healing our community that were free, that are now called alternative healings. And then when the research comes out that isn't by us or we're not included in the studies, they tell us our alternative methods are unscientific, even though we had nothing to do with the research, the development of these, what do they call them, Dr. Crosby, these evidence-based. But what I heard someone say is not evidence-based, it's the evidence doesn't involve everyone's participation. It's only for one group, and you made it for that group specifically for the purpose so that you can charge. No evidence that is more evident in the group of yoga. People don't even really understand what the basis of yoga is anymore. How commercialized it has become that we forget the roots of what we once had culturally. And so everything that we used to have was stripped and was put, something new was put in front of us and said, this is the Western style of doing things. And the Western style of doing things is always very, very expensive. But if you notice, the things that are free, the things that we can do within our communities, those are the things they try to debunk as not helpful.
Ooh, Laquanda, my goodness. I'm like, because that was so powerful. Dr. Crosby, looks like you want to add something?
1000% agree. This whole evidence-based thing is so frustrating to me because we are not, I can tell you emphatically, we are not part of these samples. We are not part of these studies at all, but they'll come out and say, oh, this works, until you sit down in front of someone who has, let alone one marginalized identity. It just doesn't work, and we are not a part of that conversation. And so it is very difficult oftentimes when we're in these spaces and in these rooms talking to colleagues and talking about the work that we do, and they're like, well, that's not how the manual says. Well, the manual wasn't normed on us. So the manual's not going to say that. So don't say I'm not being effective, because clients are still getting better. People are still getting healthier. I'm just not giving them a worksheet every week to say, fill this out, check this, track this, check that. A lot of us as communities of color, the way we heal is communal, it's relational. And you can't evidence-base a relationship because it's too dynamic. And they don't want to pay for that because relationships are long. A lot of us have trauma where we don't trust people. So a lot of the work initially is just being able to learn that people are trustworthy, that you matter, before you can even start to, that's part of the healing. But I'll go on forever. But yes, capitalism very much plays a part in it, and it is Eurocentric. And I mean, even I think about the different diagnoses, right? It doesn't take into account our cultural differences that we have. One prime example is like the diagnosis of schizophrenia. In the Black church, will connect with what we call the Holy Spirit, right? And so you're hearing and seeing something. But if you go to, I'll just say, if you go into a white professional, they might try to say you're hallucinating or having delusions or hearing voices and give you schizophrenia when you were just connecting with your higher power, however you saw fit. And that's just one example, but there are a multitude of other, communities of color who have experiences like that. But because the majority culture isn't forced to learn about our culture, we are an elective, if you will. They don't know those different nuances. And so because it doesn't align with what they deemed as normal or healthy, then it has to be pathologized, and it has to be something we have to charge you for to fix and heal.
Y'all are really going in, and I appreciate it, because this is exactly where we're headed. We're going to talk about how our communities have traditionally healed. What we're going to do is continue on that line that we've been talking about in terms of, how our communities have traditionally found methods of healing, right? What are some ways that we've done that traditionally, and how does that continue now? How can folks find support within their communities now? For that, we'll start with Laquanda. We'll go to Dr. Crosby, then we'll go to Luke, then we'll go to Kay, then we'll go to Nikaya.
You know, Dr. Crosby had brought this up earlier when he had responded about sharing the story. Within BIPOC communities, language is so important. How we use our language is so important. You know, effective communication among each other, and also storytelling. It is so powerful to sit and have conversations about things that make us uncomfortable. Conversations are healing. And I think that people forget, even in the context of therapy, at its basic form, it is a conversation. It is a conversation. And it is about, and our communities have always had that. When we deal with so much, we'll sit down and we'll have a conversation. And I was like, what language are you using? And, you know, remembering those things that bring us back to center as we define it. And I think so much that I love about our communities now is that we are starting to define who we are. We are defining who we are, and then we're telling everyone else, this is who we are. I am not fitting in your box. And so I think that the thing that I am loving right now, and the ways that we had a sense of community, is that remembering that community doesn't necessarily mean 1,000 people in the room. Community can begin with a conversation between two people who understand, who are empathetic, who are supportive, and then bring someone else in. Almost as if you experience what it knows, what it feels like to be accepted, then give that experience to someone else.
Yes, absolutely. Dr. Crosby?
Yes, thank you so much, Laquanda, for sharing that. I 1000% agree, and would really just add to that the piece about the relationship. Like, the part about like how we communicate oftentimes is about a degree of trust that we have within a relationship, who we know we could go to. Some of us might call them our good Judies, who we can go talk to and let them know whatever's going on. And a space that when you think about those relationships, even non-therapeutic relationships, just those spaces where you can show up 100%. And even on your worst day and your worst behavior, they still gonna have your back. They gonna tell you was wrong and that you need to make adjustments, but you're not gonna question their presence and the fact that they're gonna be there for you, they're gonna support you. And I think that's how therapy, therapy can mirror that. And that's how we can heal. But in addition to that, I think, like I was saying earlier, it is that piece and that focal point about the relationship and about not pathologizing experiences. And one of the things that the ways in which we communicate often is not necessarily through verbal language. As communities of color, we communicate quite a bit with our nonverbals. And we all know we can give a look, see, mm-hmm. Give a look, and we already know what we're all saying, right? And so also being able to know that those are the things, that's how we heal too, because those nonverbals give this connection. And it's like, oh, you see me, I see you, we're already communicating. And so that those bridges and bonds of trust are already starting to form. And so I think traditionally that's how we've done it. Not from a prescriptive approach, not from this manualized approach or even pathological approach, but just from an approach of understanding.
Yes, absolutely. You have me laughing over here a little bit, but 100% agree with everything you said there. Lucy?
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with Dr. Crosby and Laquanda. I think it's just when it comes down to the communities, I think we all mutually know, we kind of all mutually know that we're going through the same thing. And it's not the same thing, but similar things, if that makes sense. you know, as minority groups, we've, as queer and trans people, we've all experienced the same kind of discrimination. But I think another thing that we can talk about discrimination all day, but another thing is we don't talk about just the fetishization of queer and trans people as well. And so when it comes down to like those experiences, we've all experienced those similar things. But I was gonna say something about this last question, but I think it's appropriate to bring up now as well, because when it comes to like things we can do now for ourselves, I think it's a matter of those traditional things that are, let's say, like for example, my South Asian community are now being capitalized and used as forms of therapy, like for example, like yoga. And so I think that's a big thing that we need to understand, is that when it comes down to those coping mechanisms that were sacred to our culture and our community, how they're being used and abused in a way, and taken um, less seriously and less sacredly. And I think another thing that bothers me as well is the use of like crystals and like saging and stuff like that. Like that's very sacred to me and my cultures. Um, and now it's just kind of become, I don't want to say whitewashed, but to put it the best way, whitewashed. um, and prices are rising to buy these things that I've been using for a long time now, and now because of just how capitalized they've become. So traditional forms of like therapy for me are just regular forms for everyone else. And so when it comes down to like those things that I can do to really make sure that I am feeling comfortable and um, feeling safe and using those coping mechanisms, it's just a matter of, it's not special to me anymore, right? Because it's like everybody's doing it now. And so it's a matter of cultural appropriation, as well as just the kind of capitalized whitewashing of that form of therapy. Because yoga, in South Asian culture, it's a very, very, very big thing. um, and it was used to, like, even we look at like East Asian culture as well, like massages and cupping and stuff like that. It's just these people, specifically white cis people, have taken those things and say, this is a form of therapy you can use and this can help you. Like, here's massage therapy, when that's like it's been a thing already. It's like been a very big thing in Asian culture. And so it's like those traditional forms of um, coping aren't really traditional to, let's say, um, all of us, really, people of color.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Nikaya, do you want to add anything to that? Okay.
Sure. So I want to stress that I think I think a lot of the treatments that the mental health system in the U.S. has feels very clinical and sterilized, and doesn't really acknowledge that we're humans, in the sense that, like, for example, I'm Japanese, and every time we would experience like grief or loss, or even if it was an animal that died, we would light incense, and then my mother would read these Buddhist chants, and it's something that we always did. It was like a ritual and a practice, and something like that isn't part of like the mental health system, part of like mental health care, but for us it was a way to deal with our grief. And so I want to stress that it's okay if like our ways of healing as communities of color doesn't look like the Eurocentric way of healing, of therapy. And so it's a lot of it for me is reconnecting to my roots and kind of practicing those things that may not fit the Eurocentric view of it, but is still important to us and makes us feel like we've healed.
Yes, reconnecting to, what has been a part of our heritage and our culture for so long is so important. I know as a first generation Haitian American, Vodou is something that has been really demonized and taken apart. And I've actually found, a lot of healing in reconnecting to my spirituality and realizing that colonialism, really did its best to negate all of the beauty and wonder that can be associated with some of our community's forms of spirituality, and reconnecting with those is so important. Nikaya?
I would say a lot of the communal healing that I've noticed or has been a part of my life when it comes to being a Black person has a lot to do with traditions and cultural traditions. So, just little things like sitting between your mom's legs as she does your hair, you tell her about your day, you tell her what happened, or washing your hair in the sink, or going to get your nails done, or just I'm talking a lot about like feminine specific examples because that's all I know, but I'm sure I'm sure there are other ones, even cooking like some soul food, just the labor of love, and chopping the greens and hearing the stories that were passed down from your grandma. She taught you the proper way to stir grits and things like that. Just learning about your culture and your family through these different displays of tradition were so healing for me. And it was something that like I felt was very special to me. Like this was mine and this was my family and this was something that we had, that even if the outside world was like on fire, like I could return to this. And I still do in my everyday life as an adult.
I love that. I love that. I think you make a wonderful segue to the question that we'll be, beginning to close on, which is how do we find healing? How do we find joy? And I'm going to sort of throw a sort of combined question at you, if you will, and feel free to respond to whatever portion resonates with you the most. I would love, as we wrap, for us to share some, experiences of healing and joy. And I know on my end, something that I have found the most healing is when I experience gender euphoria. Whenever I experience gender euphoria, it literally feels like I'm healing my inner child. It feels like I'm healing, some of the challenges that my ancestors went through who could never express themselves in that way, right? It's something that has been so important to me in order to feel that joy. So I'm curious, has anyone else experienced gender euphoria, or maybe even experienced that intense gratitude around some of your other marginalized identities? And what did that look like, and what does joy look like for you, right? So that's what we're going to end on, joy and healing. All right, so with that, I am going to turn it to Laquanda. Then we're going to go to Dr. Crosby. Then we'll go to Kay. We'll go to Nikaya, and we'll close with Luke.
Oh, this is a good one. For me, I would have to say my my entire career gives me joy. I was a therapist before I knew that I was dealing with bipolar disorder and PTSD. And by my third year, that's when I ended up in a psychiatric hospital. And I absolutely lost everything. I couldn't take care of myself. I couldn't work. I couldn't take care of my then 4-year-old daughter. Everything was ripped from underneath me. And the thing that gives me the greatest joy is that there was a psychiatrist who told me that I would never be able to work in the field of mental health. And that hit me in my heart. And I realized the pain that I felt and the restriction of someone's words. And that also motivated me to never put someone in that space and in that limitation, to limit, someone's identity, and to not just gain things back, but to move in a direction that I never thought that I would be in, and to be in rooms and boldly every single time say, look, I manage bipolar disorder. And when I retired from being a therapist, it was because I was ready to do something else or tap into something else, another aspect of my identity. And it wasn't because I was too tired. It wasn't because someone told me I couldn't do it. And for me, that has been like the biggest joy for me, to not only help people along their journey, but live this life for myself as well. And I have always been grateful for the opportunity to just exist in my truest form and look at myself and say, girl, you did that.
I love that. I love that. I love that. Dr. Crosby.
That is so, so beautiful. That is so beautiful. Thank you so much. I'm thinking about just my experiences, and what comes up for me is when I've experienced like intense joy and just gratitude for my identities is when I internalized that I mattered. Because for so long, I didn't know or believe that I mattered because of my Blackness, because of my queerness, because of my Black queerness, socioeconomics, all of that. And so it's interesting because it happened for me like almost simultaneously. And so kind of becoming aware and like really marching into my Blackness, like unapologetically, not making people feel comfortable or not focused on people's comfort, but focused on, hey, I have a right to be here. I matter. I exist. You will see me. And then how that parallel with like me coming into my own queerness, because for so long I was told, for a number of reasons that I didn't matter, I wasn't important. And I didn't realize that that was something that I had taken to heart and believed. And so it wasn't until, calamity of events in life as things happen, that I had gone through like a pretty intense breakup at the, on the height of a bunch of other things. And so I was left to just kind of look at myself, and I only had me and like figuring out what was going on. I didn't have distractions of school. I didn't have distractions of family. I didn't have distractions of the relationship. I literally just had me in my apartment. And so that required like a lot of like intense work introspectively to figure out just a host of other things. And even coming to realize that I was in that relationship largely because I didn't think I mattered as much. And I stayed in the relationship that long because I didn't feel that I mattered as much. And so it wasn't until afterwards and doing the work that I came to my realization of, you know what, you're important, you matter, you deserve love, you are loved, not externally. It all comes from within, and any additional love I receive is just it's a gift. But I don't need anybody to love me because I have it for myself. And so that's where I find like that intense joy, like every day knowing that I love myself, I matter, I care about myself.
Oh my goodness, that is so beautifully said. I know that's something that's been transformative for me as well. I was working with a provider who told me to place my hand on my heart and take a deep breath and just tell myself, I'm learning how to take care of you every day. And that really helped me. Nikaya?
Sure. I think for me, learning the joy of being Black and queer at the same time was a big deal. And also learning how freeing it can be to be Black and queer at the same time, and also learning how free I could be just as a person. I felt like for a long time that I owed something to the world, or that I was supposed to be doing something that I could never quite be doing, or that I was supposed to be being something that I could never quite be, like always chasing something that wasn't really something that I wasn't really able to grasp. And once it really hit me that like I don't owe anybody anything, and that I can just be myself, and that I can just and that would just be enough, was just like astounding. And seeing how many people have done that throughout all of time really meant so much to me, because it made me realize that I wasn't alone. Like I remember being on Pinterest and just seeing pictures of like old Black queer couples from like the 1800s, like the 1950s, and just realizing how old the feeling of loving somebody of the same gender is, and how it's not new, and how, you know, it's not something that is just me. Obviously, it's not just me, but sometimes you just feel so alone. And then you realize that this was something that's ancestral. This is something that's beautiful, something that was just given to you through generations and generations of other people loving so that you could be here. And now you have the ability to love the way that you need to love. And I don't know, it just really makes me feel as though I can do anything. And then also recognizing that I'm kind of at this stage in my life where I'm going to be telling stories about this period of time when I'm like older to like younger people, hopefully my grandchildren, who's to say if I'm going to have them. But at some point I'm going to be like, I was in my 20s doing this and doing that, and I don't want to spend my 20s doing things that I won't want to look back on when I'm like 80 something and smile about. So just having those constant reminders keep me grounded of the fact that I'm free to do whatever I need to do, and making sure that the choices that I make are something that would make 80-year-old Nikaya really happy have really brought me joy.
I love that so much. Something I heard the poet Alok say is that, when you think about our, trans and gender expansive ancestors, and how, just leaving the house in an authentic manner could often mean death or jail, etc. Why would they keep doing that? And Alok said it's because they were writing love letters to future trans and gender expansive folks. And I thought that was so beautiful. Okay.
For me, I know that I have specific experiences where I felt a lot of joy. Like when I was in and out of the mental health system in high school, there was a prompt from some of the counselors that, hey, I was in a partial hospitalization program, and they said, hey, when you go home, make sure that you get ready for tomorrow, where we're all going to dress up and look nice, basically. And I remember the first time we got that prompt, I just wore, like, I didn't really dress up. I wasn't really wearing something that I wanted to wear. It was just like a dress that I found in my closet. And at the time, I was like, I'm not really feeling this. And I was also dealing with a lot of racism from some of the counselors. That the next week that we did that, I put on, a lot of people know it as a kimono, but it's not actually a kimono. It's a yukata, which is the summer version that I wore. And I wore a yukata the next time. And I remember feeling like really, I don't know, it was just feeling of like, I'm me, and like, I love how I look right now. I love how like I'm in my cultural clothing, and like also there's some racist counselors, but I don't care because I look really cute right now. So I remember that feeling of like, I really like connecting with my culture and like dressing to reflect that and that gender expression too. And so I think now I find joy in the fact that I've been out of the mental health system for 4 years now, actually coming up this month. And so I'm really proud of myself in the fact that I was able to go to school in the end, and I'm actually a college student, and I managed to graduate high school and get out of the mental health system. And so I find joy in the fact that like, okay, I've proven to myself that I can do this, and I can live a life worth living, and I matter, and I can take up space. And so these are all things that like I look at my own progress, and I'm like growing my confidence and feel like I'm okay, like I can do this. Yeah.
Wow, wow, wow. And yes, you are okay. And yes, you can do this. You all have really, really brought so much joy to my heart. Thank you for being so vulnerable. Again, want to thank all of our panelists today for being so vulnerable and sharing such wonderful information. I hope those of you who are watching found it helpful. And, remember that everything that you're feeling is real, and there are ways that folks before you have healed, and you can tap into those. There are people around you in your communities that are finding ways to heal that you can tap into, whether it's support groups, healing circles, etc. Right? So let's do our best to be honest about how we're feeling and open about how we're feeling, and find that help where we need it and in a way that it feels authentic to ourselves. So thank you again to all of our panelists. And with that, we will close out the 6th annual panel discussion on queer and trans BIPOC mental health. Thank you so much. We appreciate you all. Hopefully you'll join us next year. Take care.